So I'm really wanting to talk a little bit about the region where I'm coming from, and then just talk about some of the links that we're making between here and where I'm coming from. So the area that I'm working in is the wet-dry tropics of Australia, and it's an area that makes up this light shaded here on the map. So it's the sort of top 25% of Australia. And that represents an area of about 463,000 square miles, I believe. So about the same area as if you put Texas and California together. But instead of having 67 million people, we've got 300,000 people. And 110,000 of them, like me, live in Darwin, in this one city up there. So the rest of this region has about 200,000 people. And of that population, about 30% of the people living there are Aboriginal people. And that's across the whole total. But in some of the catchments, you know, the population of Aboriginal people can represent about 70–80% of the population. So it's a quite unique population structure compared with the rest of the country. The other thing that really sets it apart and defines the wet-dry tropics is the high seasonality of the rainfall. So we get about 50 inches of rainfall a year, but about 80% of it falls in just 3 months of the year. So we have a short but very intense wet season in our summer, and then this is followed by a long, extended, effectively a seasonal drought that occurs every year in the dry season. And it's pretty warm throughout the year. In fact, the weather we've got out here outside at the moment is about the coolest it gets in our dry season. Now, as a consequence of that highly seasonal rainfall, and also the fact that these are some of the most ancient soils on the planet, so they're very nutrient poor, we don't have tropical rainforest, we have tropical savanna. And so it's dominated by gum trees as the overstory, and then a continuous understory of annual grasses that grow up to about 2 metres high and then die off each year in an annual cycle. And less than about 1% of that natural vegetation has been cleared across the whole area, so most of it still remains intact. As a consequence of that highly seasonal rainfall, we have dramatic changes in the patterns of the river flows. And so in the wet season, most of these rivers flow down to the floodplains at the coastal area and then spill over their banks every year, flooding thousands of square miles of tropical floodplain. And then a few months later, the floodplains are dry, the main channels remain in most of these river systems, many of these river systems, but in many cases they'll dry back to a series of just disconnected water holes, or they'll dry up completely. So there's an abundance of highly seasonal flowing river systems in this region. But it's not to say that they're not important. There's about the 55 major watersheds across that large area that I showed you. And of those, if you put them together, they contribute about half of Australia's total river flow. So about half of Australia's freshwater discharges out through these river systems in those 3 months of the year. And because of the lack of development in the area, the low population density, there's very little land that's being cleared, and most of that water in those river systems flows uninterrupted from the headwaters out to the estuaries. Less than about 0.02% of that water is diverted for other purposes such as agricultural development. Our big river system in the southern part of Australia, the Murray-Darling system, it's more like 60–70% of that water is being used for other purposes. So these river systems are very important, and as a result they have very high biodiversity and conservation values. We have internationally recognised World Heritage listed wetlands and Ramsar listed wetlands. They're also suggested that they're very important in terms of the commercial and recreational fishing and tourism in the region. There's very tasteful tourism in the region, is often based around the products from those river systems. So whether it's crocodiles, or also it's focused on the wetland areas, tours on the wetlands or looking at the waterfalls seems to be a real draw card for tourism. And the plants and animals that come from those river systems are really important for Aboriginal people who still undertake customary harvests quite extensively across the river systems. But in the last 10 years or so, southern Australia has been experiencing major droughts, and as a result people have been looking at the water in the north, and that's combined in a couple of record wet seasons that we've had in the north, which has resulted in even larger flooding than normal. And as a result we're seeing these major headlines in the newspapers on an increasing basis that all the water that's up there is just going to waste. So despite the fact that it's likely to be important for these other reasons I've mentioned, the widespread perception from southern Australia is that we've just got this big empty landscape, we've got loads of water up there, and let's do something with it. Now, it was in that context that a lot of proposals are being put forward to have more land clearing in the region so that we can have irrigated agriculture, largely drawing on the groundwater reserves in the dry season, to support more cropping and hay production for cattle grazing. And there have been lots of large-scale proposals put forward, but these images are from one of the catchments that we do a lot of work on, the Daly River, where this is already happening. And so there has been a moratorium placed on that because people were concerned that we were going down the same path as Southern Australia and going to have a huge bill to try and repair these things once we've over-allocated the waters and destroyed the river systems. So there was a widespread concern that we wanted to do things differently in the north, and we would try and do it in a more sustainable way than had been experienced in Southern Australia. And so responding to that, we formed this thing called TRACK, the Tropical Rivers and Coastal Knowledge Research Hub. And TRACK brings together a consortium of 80 researchers from across Australia, and it's a very multidisciplinary group. We've got a range of biophysical scientists, social scientists, economists, anthropologists, quite a broad range of people involved in it. And over the past 5 years, we've been involved in 27 different research projects, and most of those have been focused around these three pretty fundamental questions. Firstly, we're trying to get a better understanding of why people value tropical rivers. What is it about them, the social, economic, cultural values that people derive from rivers? There's a lot of work on the ecosystem processes that are underpinning the things that people value in river systems. So how do those river systems work? And then, given that there's a wealth of information coming from these projects, we're looking at ways of pulling that information together to try and help make land managers' jobs easier when it comes to making well-informed decisions. And that's the overall aim of the program, is to improve the science and knowledge that's available for governments, communities and industries so that they can make better informed decisions about the sustainable management of these river systems. And in contrast to Southern Australia, we're doing it before the big decisions about land use and water allocation have already been made. And so what have we found? Well, one of the things that we found through a lot of work on stable isotope analysis and trying to understand the basis of the food webs in these systems is that it's the connections between these systems that is really important in supporting one of the things that people do value, which is the important recreational and cultural fisheries, recreational commercial fisheries. And this is a barramundi. It's probably a bit like the striped bass over here, I guess. It's a really important, iconic species in the region, and it underpins really important tourism as well as recreational fishing by the locals and commercial fishing. And if you look at where the biomass in those large barramundi comes from, about 20% of it comes from the river itself. But nearly 40% of it comes from the floodplain, and more than 40% of it comes from the estuary. And so it's the fact that these systems still remain connected from the headwaters down through the floodplains and out onto the estuaries, which allows these floodplains, which only hold water for a couple of months of the year, massive production occurs on those floodplains during that wet season. It's then transported upstream to the river and downstream to the estuary, and the production that occurs in the estuary can move upstream through the rivers because we don't have dams that are stopping that movement of fish throughout the system. So that connections and which allows the movement from those highly productive parts of the river system and the coastal system to still be maintained is absolutely fundamental to supporting the productivity of these systems. Now, one of the other things that we've done quite differently to other programs in the north is that we've really engaged with the traditional owners of the landscape, so Aboriginal people. And in the Northern Territory that Bill talked about, Aboriginal people own legally 80% of the coastline, 45% of the land mass. So they're very important partners, but they've often been overlooked in terms of research and also making decisions about the allocation of water. So we worked with Aboriginal people quite heavily in doing work, say for example on fish, where we had Aboriginal rangers who were involved in collecting that information. But we also did systematic surveys and interviews with Aboriginal people about their knowledge of fish. What do fish eat? Where do the fish occur? When do they turn up? When do they move? And how are they using those fish? And there was a number of reasons for doing that. One is that the old people in these groups are holders of the knowledge, and there's difficulties with cultural passing of that knowledge down to the younger generations these days. And so as a result, a lot of that knowledge is being lost. And so they were very keen for us to record that knowledge. And we've done that, producing things such as posters and videos and so on that's recording the knowledge in a way that makes it accessible to the younger kids. And these are now being used in schools and culture camps and so on. It's been a really important part of the program. But we also wanted that information because it supplements us going out there 2 times a year doing sampling of fish. If we can get information that's been derived over tens of thousands of years, then that's really important knowledge. And so we've been able to develop ways of modelling and incorporating into models both the Western science and also the indigenous knowledge, and we've used that in a number of ways. One of those is to look at the risk to the various freshwater fish species in this daily river system as a result of taking water out during the dry season for irrigated agriculture. And so what we've found is that some species are at very high risk because of changes to the life history, changes to the habitat and so on that will result as a result of extraction of dry season flows. Other species are unlikely to be affected, but it means that for the first time we can come up with a much more objective way of looking at which species we should be monitoring, which should be the targets of monitoring if we're going to be looking at the implications of changing river flows. And it comes out that there's a couple of species here that are really important. Barramundi, the one that's really important commercially, and that's one of the species that's most at risk from these changes in dry season flows. And another species that comes out important is the Black Brim. And that's important, largely the importance of that has only become recognised since our program. The reason for that is that we've been doing a lot of work which has been working with Aboriginal people to document how they're using the resources in these river systems. So surveying where they were catching things, when they were catching things, and what was the fate of those things that they caught. And what we've found is that we've done this in a number of different river systems now, but in most cases there's about half a dozen species that account for about 90% of the total collected harvest from these river systems. But it's an incredibly diverse range of resources that are being harvested. There are turtles, there's plants, there's fish, this is that black brim I was talking about, there's birds. It's a very diverse group of fauna and plants, and they all have very different water requirements. Previously, when we've done environmental flow allocations in these river systems, we've just looked to how much water we needed to protect barramundi. Well, barramundi come a long way down the list of importance for Aboriginal people, and these group of organisms up here have much more diverse patterns of water use. So we have to be much more general in the way we think about preserving water in these systems if we're to meet the needs of Aboriginal people. The other thing with these graphs is that the dark line is how much is being collected, the grey line is actually how much is being consumed by the person that collected those. The difference between them is the amount that is being traded, shared and spread within the community and also between communities. So it's a very important part of the social and cultural framework in these resources, in these communities, is how they share those resources that are harvested from the rivers. The other thing that we've done is using replacement values to try and model the economics of this. So how much does it cost if you had to go and buy steak from the shop instead of harvesting a turtle from the river? And in doing that, we've been able to come up with some numbers and put a figure on the economic value. And the figures aren't enormous, but when you're dealing with Aboriginal communities who are the most impoverished communities in Australian society, then the contribution of these wild harvested resources actually makes a very substantial contribution to their household economy. And if you go back to that list of species that were at risk, there's quite a few of those species that were in the top half a dozen or so that are harvested by Aboriginal people that are also in the top species that are most at risk. So Aboriginal people have a lot to lose from changes that result from conventional forms of agricultural development in these catchments. And people usually say, well, you can offset that by the fact that they benefit from the economic activity that occurs in the catchment. And the modelling that we've done on the economics shows that if you're to try and achieve something like a 5% growth in agricultural development in these systems, there's a number of changes that occur as a result of that. You'll increase water use, the blue lines here, by at least 30%, up to a couple 100%, depending on what type of crop you're using over a 20-year period. And over that 20-year period, a 5% increase in agriculture results in a major increase in the employment of non-Aboriginal people in the catchment, and a nearly 25% increase in the household economy of non-Aboriginal people in the catchment. But when you look at the Aboriginal people in the catchment, there's a very small increase in employment and an almost negligible increase in household economy as a result of conventional forms of development. The Aboriginal people are not set up, equipped, job ready, they don't have businesses that can take advantage of those conventional forms of agricultural development in the catchment. So there's really two separate economic models, systems that operate in these catchments. There's a non-Indigenous one which will do very well out of conventional agriculture. There's the Aboriginal one which doesn't really benefit from it, and there's not much leakage from one economic sector to the other. So Aboriginal people have a lot to lose and not very much to benefit. And for the first time, we're now being able to incorporate all these different components of the research projects, put them together so that we can see how changes in river flows over time might affect some of these things that people value. So in the natural system where we had 100% of river flow and we maintained all our habitat, we had no economic development. If we wanted to achieve that 5% growth with unrestricted use of the water, we'd halve our river flow, we'd lose 2/3 of our fish habitat, but we would achieve our economic goals without any problems. But we can moderate that by putting in a water allocation plan which restricts the time at which you can take water. And you can still achieve agricultural goals, economic goals, but you're still preserving something of the river flows and the fish habitat. Now, we're not saying one of these is better than the other, but what we're saying is that for the first time, people are actually able now to sit down and look transparently at the trade-offs between those different alternatives. So it's really showing that the work we're doing is demonstrating that there's multiple values, that the information is now being used by governments when it comes to water planning to try and have a much more informed debate about the trade-offs. And so where to next? Well, this is where we come to some of the similar challenges. The work that we've been doing is focused very much on how these systems operate. We now want to move from studying systems to solving problems. And Bill has written about this a long time ago and has really been doing the action of this research and moving it much more towards focus on management outcomes. And the work that's happening in Chesapeake Bay is a good example of how you would achieve some of that. And there's also some similar issues around climate change, for example, and sea level rise. Now, I drive around the peninsula and I see a lot of flat country that reminds me of where I'm from. This shows that the vast amounts of the coastline that is less than 1 metre in elevation, the green areas here, and most of that are those highly productive floodplain areas. And when sea level rises increases, and in northern Australia we have some of the highest rates of sea level rise in the country, and with those increases in sea level rise, we see areas where the freshwater wetlands become inundated with salt water, and we've seen it in a couple of locations already. And in some of these places, what was once a productive Melaleuca floodplain forest is now 42,000 acres of dead trees and hypersaline swamp. So we've got some major issues, but at least we're now tackling those with a much more informed knowledge base as a result of the work that came from TRAC. Some of these tools and approaches and the models we've developed are going to help us make better decisions for how we respond to those sorts of challenges. And the managers we work with are more equipped to deal with that, and we're better equipped to do research on it. So it's a very solid foundation for solving those problems, but I think there's some real opportunities for us to learn from what's happening in Chesapeake Bay around both the approaches to management and in particular the way that you communicate the outcomes from research and have that feed into policy and management.